What we've got here is failure to communicate. Some men you just can't reach. So you get what we had here last week, which is the way he wants it. Well, he gets it. And I don't like it any more than you, man.
Welcome everyone to what has become my first ever feature-length film. I'm Mike Sanello, and in this video I'm going to go over my final and parting thoughts on this whole community center debate. Before we start, I wanted to let everyone know that it was my initial intention for this video to be exhaustive, but that turned into a 4-hour-long Odyssean epic, and there's no reason to make everyone sit through Ben-Hur to make my point. So instead of calling this video exhaustive, I think I'll consider it comprehensive. I also want to let everyone know that the reason I've gone through this effort is because I want everyone to know how my thoughts have evolved and to see exactly why it is that I've reached a point where I can consider my thoughts to have culminated in a conclusion. So if you don't want to sit through the background, skip to the timestamp in this video's description to jump straight to my parting thoughts. Alright, now to dive right into the video. Now, I could have started all the way back in 2015 when the Board of Education was having its meetings to discuss the closure of John Pettibone's school. But I think that the whole topic here is the idea of a community center, specifically. And I'm actually going to start with the June 27, 2016 Town Council meeting because this is the first time that this idea to convert John Pettibone School into a proper community center was ever formally presented to a governing body. And this is, I think, where, when it comes to actual legislative action, this entire topic of debate begins.
Anybody that saw my campaign or asked me, I told them exactly what I was planning on doing at Pettibone. It was to move the agencies in the East Street building, Board of Education, as well as the youth agency, and some other agencies around town. The idea is that JPS will become a community center, and this is what I ran on. I mean, it shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody that my idea was to keep Pettibone School and use it as a community center.
So you can see in these two clips how Dave presents this as a campaign promise, and the why for doing this seems to be, so far, just to fulfill a campaign promise. Our why here is based on an a priori argument that it's self-evident that we need a community center and that it has to be at John Pettibone School and that it's got to manifest the way that Dave Groenbeck unilaterally has decided it ought to manifest. So in this next clip, we get the first and what I would consider our only argument for this campaign promise that isn't a priori.
And we have a real need for it because the East Street building is an anchor around our neck. It is not ADA compliant. We're one lawsuit away from hundreds of thousands of dollars in expenses to upgrade it.
Okay, this argument's been tossed around like a proverbial football, and in the 2.5 years since that recording, it hasn't seemed to go away. Now, I already did a video on this. That building does not need to be ADA compliant. It was grandfathered into the Americans with Disabilities Act because it predated the Americans with Disabilities Act and was on the National Register of Historic Places. So I'll post a link to that video in this video's description, and hopefully I'll be able to post a link to the KG&D study that dispels that myth. We are not one lawsuit away from hundreds of thousands of dollars or millions of dollars in expenses. The building does not need to meet ADA requirements. Let's just end that myth right here and now. Now, there was a lot of discussion at the time about how a change of intended use in a 75,000 square foot, highly purpose-built facility was going to cost millions of dollars. And before anyone actually gets to show Dave that it's going to cost millions of dollars, because we don't know how much it's going to cost at this point, Dave explains his thoughts on that matter.
There's no $1 million upgrades.
Don't worry, folks. The montage of expenses that we have incurred and that we will likely incur is coming. We're going to get to that. But for now, and I think this is a really important aspect of this video, one of the questions that needs to be answered is, since you're going to change the intended purpose of this highly purpose-built building to a community center, we need to know what exactly a community center is. So I think this is the only time that Dave really puts a formal definition on what he conceives of as a community center.
And to provide a space for the community to come in one center space where they could have space, they could have rooms, they could have events, and it would truly be between the cafeteria and the library and some of the classrooms there. it would truly be a community-oriented space.
So what he's talking about is consolidating administrative offices and facilities and creating public meeting space. Now, I was a member of the Facilities Utilization Committee here in town, and one of the things that we analyzed was exactly how much meeting space we have. That seems to be one of the few things that we have in this town in surplus. And by the way, we're getting a heck of a lot more of it with this new library modernization project. Now, I realize that the library modernization project hadn't come to full fruition at June 27, 2016, but it's something to really take into consideration. So in project management, a major aspect of any proper cost-benefit analysis is a review of alternative projects and alternative ideas. So let's hear what Dave has to say on that matter on June 27th, 2016.
My mind's not closed to anything yet.
Oh, really? So how about the Taylor Protocol, which you seem to have ignored? Now, we know that in hindsight, and I haven't had the opportunity at this point on June 27, 2016, to present my Taylor Protocol, but we're going to get to that, and I will present a link to that video in this video's description. Now, as you may know, the Board of Education every few years puts together a 5-year capital plan, and this includes expenses for things like major facilities renovations. So PPAS presents the 2012 to 2017 Board of Education capital plan to show Dave Groenbeck just how much it's going to cost long-term to keep this building open.
Thank you, Mayor. I did happen to find some capital expenditures that the Board of Education did in their facilities committee that they did bring to the board when they had their meeting at John Pettibone. They're showing a projected cost for 2 boilers as the life expectancy is 25 to 30 years. The estimated time, and this was back in 2015, was within 5 years, so now we're down to 4. That's $295,000. They say the roof is well past warranty, was on the list to be replaced once you finish the work at Scotticoke Middle School. That's $1.388 million. An oil tank needs to be replaced with the above ground unit. That could be within 12 years, but that's $145,000. Fire alarm is nearing its obsolescence. I can't pronounce it. Needs to be replaced. Thank you. $52,000. Parking lot needs to be resurfaced and repaved. $52,000.
I can do it for 40.
Nice.
That's a lot of money for that building.
Windows, although the window work, long-term use of the building would require that 1/3 of the windows would need replacement. That's $118,000. So just on this one form, you're at $2,066,000. I then have another form where we talked similar to the cost avoidance, where they also talk about asphalt seal paving for JPS was $55,000. Security upgrades that you may or may not need now with the new reconfiguration of how you want to do it, that's another $119,000. So my question would be whether it be these monies, half the monies, 1/4 of the monies. What's your thought process as to how we're going to finance that?
I say none of those monies.
Based on what, Dave? Pete Bass produced a report to show you exactly why he thought the expenses that he thought were going to incur were going to be incurred. Do you have a report like that? Do you have a specialized expertise in the field that we can rely on as an attorney?
I say that's pie in the sky. I say if I wanted to get a report right now, what would it take to keep Roger Sherman Town Hall open? I could find, justification for $2 million. The roof is not caving in. The boilers are working. That's good enough for me.
Pie in the sky? Based on what? So the report itself is invalid? Why, Dave? How about you tell us exactly why you think that is? I'll believe you if you can provide a good rationale as to invalidate that report's conclusions. Also, the standard you just set is a deplorably low standard. The roof isn't actively collapsing? Come on, Dave.
And once we get people in there, we're going to have some self-sustaining tenants that are going to contribute to the cost of maintaining Pettibone.
Okay, so the idea is that it doesn't matter what the costs are because we're going to offset that with rentals. Well, again, we'll get into this in a bit because we need to know if we're going to offset this cost with rentals exactly how much those renters are going to be willing to pay.
We do have a lot of interest from nonprofit organizations that are looking to pay rent.
So a fair question at this point is, who exactly are those nonprofits and how much are they actually willing to pay? It's hindsight, so we know the answer to this question already. And it's probably unfair for me to do this because it's hindsight, but let me show you exactly how much they're willing to pay.
We've been listening to all the discussions regarding the community center, and then one of the buildings they've been talking about is John Pettibone and the revenue it generates, but are we not charging for usage of that space, or?
No, it ain't there yet.
Because we budgeted $5,000 in revenue and there's $0 to date.
I don't know who would be responsible for doing that, for renting the space out. So if there's no revenue, that means obviously there's been no rental of the space, or if there has been rental of the space, no revenue has been collected.
Okay, thank you.
I don't think anyone can go in there to rent because we haven't done all we need for zoning. Is that correct?
That's incorrect.
Oh,
The gym can be used, the cafeteria. can
Oh,
be
those
used, all
rooms,
the
yeah.
rooms can be used.
you're right.
There's a
I'm
large
sorry.
number that can be used. And that are used.
I mean, in fairness, it should have been very obvious to anyone who's ever worked with a nonprofit that these nonprofits are nonprofit and don't have a whole lot of money to spend on things like rent. And generally speaking, are looking for any facility they can use for free. So the obvious next question is, how much is this whole thing going to cost? We really need a budget at this point, at least some vague idea of the expenses that we're going to expect moving forward. Pete Bass asks this question directly, and Dave answers.
I'll get you a budget. It'll be based on real numbers in real time, and it'll identify the cost of moving this, getting the building up to speed, but also the savings that we're going to realize as a result of it, and some of the revenue and income that we're going to see as well. Yes.
Okay, so let's make that really clear. We need a budget, and it's going to show exactly how much this whole project is going to cost, including how much revenue you would expect to generate from the nonprofits that you plan to move in, how much it's going to cost to consolidate those administrative facilities, and hopefully we'll get into things like opportunity cost and alternative methods. And at this point, the obvious idea to me seems to be, yeah, we do need a group of people to get together to oversee exactly what these costs, exactly what the revenues we can project are going to be, because this seems like a bit much for one person to oversee. In fact, Jessica Richardson, a member of Dave's own party, is the first one to bring up this concern.
I'm assuming we're going to need to come up with the amount that these nonprofits would have to pay in
Sure.
rent for. So is there going to be a committee put together to decide how much they're going to need to pay in rent? And then on top of that, if we could also get a list of the agencies and or nonprofits that are looking to go into the building.
Myself and our economic development director are hands-on on this. So when we have a recommendation for a rental rate or a lease agreement, we'll come to the town council and we'll just inform you of it and explain where those numbers come from.
So the cynical way of looking at that video is, I am the committee. And we have hindsight, so we can be skeptical as to whether or not the committee gets formed and whether or not those projection of revenue streams ever gets produced. But it's June 27, 2016. For now, let's just set that skepticism aside. So at this point, I personally want an architectural design, something like what we got with the Library Modernization Committee. And at least, and I do mean at the very least, some master plan of how this thing is going to manifest. At the next town council meeting, Dave presents his master plan.
I've got a schematic here, not to distract everybody. This is, I hope everybody can see this, kind of a breakdown of the Pettibone building from front to back.
So Dave does go into, generally speaking, where he thinks the administrative offices are going to fall. I will link to that video in this video's description. For now, for the sake of concision, this is how he thinks that this is going to manifest. And if you really want to focus in on this, pause the video now. Okay, now we need a master plan that's going to include the total project's expenses. We need a proper budget. David's response to a request for a complete project budget is kind of terrifying.
As I get numbers and as I get estimates for costs, I'll come back and I'll explain that.
Mayor, have you gotten any costs on any of the upgrades that we are going to need for this?
No, that's what I'm trying to get.
Is it really your intention to commit to a major project on a pay-as-you-go basis with no formal cost estimate? I'm not sure exactly how you want us to interpret that. And I'm not convinced that the way to interpret that is that you're suggesting you intend to get formal cost estimates, engineering reports, architectural plans, cost alternatives, revenue projections, economic research studies, all things the library committee spent years getting before we dug our heels into such a major project. And let's not kid ourselves. A total redesign of a 75,000 square foot purpose-built structure's intended use is a major project. So again, September 12, 2016, it doesn't appear that we have a scope of work.
And are you looking to get a general contractor, or will it be Public Works that will be the general contractor?
I guess that's where we're kind of defining the scope of the work that needs to be done.
So explicitly, September 12, 2016, no scope of work. So a little bit of background, the prior mayoral administration did want to put together a committee to have this conversation and to do things like establish a scope of work. Pete brings this up.
And are you thinking of the John Pettibone Committee to help with that, or is it just Public Works and they come into council?
Well,
How do you envision that?
I envision it as, I'm kind of
The committee?
pushing this and working with my department heads. If it gets, too big for me to handle, I'll be the first person to say, let's appoint a committee to help me kind of identify and move this project along.
Groenbeck says there won't be a committee, and he essentially says that he's not willing to allow one to form unless this project gets out of hand and becomes too grandiose for him to handle himself as one person without a specialized expertise in this field. I feel like I'm beating a dead horse here, but a total redesign of a 75,000 square foot purpose-built structure's intended purpose sounds to me like a major project that you shouldn't entrust to one person. Okay, so I'm going to fast forward a little bit to the October 24th, 2016 Town Council meeting. I'm going to start with a clip of the motion for our first budget presentation on this matter. This is an important date to remember because this is the first time the public starts to really weigh in on their thoughts on the project's expenses and the scope of work. And I'm including a little bit of public comment on the matter because that did help inform my decision moving forward. It was my intention to do this in as chronological an order as I possibly can, and you'll see that moving forward. I'm going to be doing this in as chronological an order as possible. But I think it's important to see the motion first so that you can get an understanding of what the public is actually commenting on.
Motion to approve an appropriation of $225,000 from the Waste Management Account Landfill Settlement Fund. This funding will be used to perform work at the Pettibone Building to effectuate its use as a community center and house the Parks and Recreation, Youth Agency, and Social Services departments and programs. The work is to allow public recreation and educational uses at the Pettibone School.
Okay, so remember that. October 24th, 2016, $225,000. And we're going to get into exactly what those costs are intended to cover in just a moment. But before we do that, allow me to toot my own horn. This is the first meeting where I presented an alternative approach, alternative methods, things you would normally review in any proper cost-benefit analysis. And for those of you who want to say I was against the community center idea from the start, eat your hearts out. Well, I actually think the community center idea is really a good idea on its merits, but the need to use JPS for that site is, well, let's see if we can find something else, and I'm going to go ahead and suggest something else, an alternative, rather than just complain. So in 2012, the Board of Ed got an MLA agent to get an appraisal for the 16 acres or so, 16.1, less the acreage for the playground that's there, and they appraised it at $11.4 million in 2012, and that's with it residentially zoned. It was recommended at the time by the town council that if it were to be sold, it should be rezoned as industrial, so not only to increase the tax revenue from that $11.4 million, but also to create ongoing tax revenue when you have things like generators and turbines inside a plant. You pay taxes on them because they're assets, not expenses. So the other piece of property that I would suggest to you, and perhaps this is a bit nepotistic, but Taylor's is on the market for $1.78 million, and I'll just go over some benefits, and you guys can review if you'd like. For that $11.4 million, you probably get more than that in an appraisal value. You wouldn't necessarily get more or less than that when it comes time to actually sell it, but at $1.78 million, you'd have if you were to get the appraisal value, a lot of money to renovate or build a state-of-the-art facility. One of the major complaints that was brought up, when this was first brought up in July to the town council, was from the Parks and Rec saying that they have a multitude of locations, and they actually do. The town is actually renting commercial garage space behind Arby's to house a number of their vehicles and equipment. And I remember that somebody brought up that Parks and Rec was hoping to consolidate all of these facilities into a single place. Taylor's actually could provide that. They have a huge three-bay garage that could house all of their vehicles and equipment quite comfortably. Additionally, they're directly across the street. One of the complaints they had was that facility behind Arby's is kind of difficult to limp vehicles over to the town garage in the event that you have to limp a vehicle over to the town garage to get it repaired. Patriot Drive is actually virtually adjacent to that property, and you could very easily get an easement from the Housatonic Railway Authority or right away from the Housatonic Railway Authority to just drive whatever vehicles you need to right over the tracks. If not, to just put a little apron over next to the track so you can get your vehicles up over there without doing great amounts of damage. Obviously, some of the repairs that I would suggest to you are expensive, but as I suggested, I'm proposing an alternative, and it would be, I think, helpful to look into it. They also have a giant indoor warehouse that was meant for trim and finished wood, which could very easily be converted to a gym facility. Now, it would be probably relatively expensive, but if you already have the working capital to do it, and it is, say, $11.4 million or more, then you'd probably be under that amount. Of course, you would have to get engineers' reports and appraisals to get the actual dollar amount to do all this work. Additionally, they complained about a town kitchen. Well, directly across the street from that is the Max, which is a commercial kitchen, which houses a commercial kitchen and a meeting facility. Additionally, there's the rental center, which could be easily converted to something like that. Inside that, surrounding the rental facility is was formerly the large open lot for lumber. So that'd be like your pressure-treated wood, your Doug fir, and your roofing supplies. And that's actually could be very easily converted to a very large parking facility as well. One of the added benefits of this site is simply that it's just right here in town and could be very easily gotten to. Now, one of the groups that wants to move into there, you said, was the Board of Ed. I think that you could very easily knock down the old hardware store itself and convert that into exactly a state-of-the-art facility for the Board of Education. Additionally, you would probably be able to have the money to actually do all of that, and it would clear away space for the right-of-way for Parks and Rec to get across those tracks. You offered the suggestion of field space. Well, actually, Young's Field is right there too. Given that you could use that right-of-way to get to Patriot Drive, you would effectively have a right-of-way if the town so chose to get to the parking lot that's immediately above Young's Field that at least I still use to get down there occasionally. So just to reiterate the basics of that motion, they were looking to appropriate $225,000 for this project out of the Waste Management Fund. Now, there was a long back and forth about whether or not it was appropriate to take that money from the Waste Management Settlement Fund. I'm not going to get into that in this video, but I will show this clip of Joe DiGregorio, who was at the time on the Board of Finance, and I think it does pretty succinctly call up the question that was raised in that meeting.
This is the outline for the landfill settlement fund and the actual town charter from Ecode 360. We keep, as a Board of Finance member, I keep seeing things coming to us that are maintenance issues, like the maintenance of the library, which I'm very much for. I think we should build a new library. I don't see the word maintenance anywhere in the code. I see construction. Construction is building new things, land appropriations, those sorts of things. But as a Board of Finance member, if we could just maybe review that on the legal side.
So again, I'm just going to breeze over that topic because it's not really central to this video's intended purpose. And I'll go ahead and just let you decide if you think that that appropriation source was appropriate. The big thing to focus on at this point in this video is that it's October 24th, 2016, and we're finally being presented with a proper budget. It's $225,000, so the obvious next question is, what exactly does that $225,000 cover?
And this is the budget to get our departments into this building. I haven't included a budget with regards to the Board of Ed because the Board of Ed hasn't made any decisions about whether they want to go into the building, and I'm certainly not going to force them to. So I don't have time in this video to go over the whole Board of Ed side of this discussion. I will post a link in this video's description to the 06776 podcast on podbean.com.
There you can find some audio recordings of the subcommittee meetings for the Board of Education. I'll also link to the Board of Education's page on Vimeo where you can find videos of the Board of Education's board meetings, and you can kind of inform yourself on the matter. I will get into this a little bit later as to exactly what their decision was and a really basic conversation of how they reached it. But for now, we're going to just breeze over that. What's really pertinent to that clip is what exactly that $225,000 is going to cover. So it seems to me like this is a highly specific cost within a greater project scope. So we don't really have a whole scope of work and a whole project cost. So we'll get into the details on that matter in just a moment, but since I'm trying to present this in at least some sort of chronological order, let me first show you the idea that Dave presents and that has for some reason persisted as a justification for keeping the building open.
The fact that Pettibone School is there is a safety valve in case there is a catastrophic loss of one of the schools. We're not putting kids in trailers or anything like that, that we could quickly utilize the school to continue providing educational services.
Okay, so for some reason this myth has persisted to this day, so let me go ahead and just completely debunk this myth. We need to turn Pettibone into a community center, as Dave describes, and fill it and occupy it as Dave describes, so that in the event of a catastrophic emergency at one of our schools, we can bring the kids over to Pettibone and use that facility as an emergency educational facility. So we have New Milford High School. It's full of kids. We have some sort of catastrophic emergency, and we need to send kids off to an emergency facility. Maybe not all of them, but at least some of them. Here's our emergency facility. It's not being used as a community center. It's empty. Watch what happens. Oh, just watch those students transfer right over to that empty facility. Scenario 2. So we have New Milford High School. It's full of kids. We also have John Pettibone Community Center. It's got all kinds of nonprofits in it and administrative offices, and it's filled to the brim. Uh-oh, catastrophic emergency at New Milford High School. We need to transfer a whole bunch of kids to John Pettibone Community Center. Let's see what happens. Here we go. Okay, now that my pants are ruined, let's go ahead and discuss exactly what that $225,000 is going to cover.
So under the construction line, what is actually happening in that line? Youth agency, social services, partners. What are we doing in that construction line?
This is minor construction to build out anything within those classrooms. So there's some construction of built-in desks and bookcases, things of that nature.
Partitions, things like that. You're breaking those.
Not so much partitions. No, I mean we're using a lot of the mobile partitions. The stuff that you could buy, those cloth ones. I think they have them at the Board of Ed now, actually. Anyway, to separate a classroom up into. So it's not a permanent partition for the most part. But,
so wiring-wise, was there inadequate power, or is this for communications? What kind of
wiring is there. There's different stages in the building. Some of the panels still have the screw and fuses. So that's being upgraded. Actually, the wing in the back is the most modern. It's got the most up-to-date fuse boxes.
But that's cut you off. That would be in the electrical line, is what I'm saying.
Oh, panels and
when
feeders,
we're talking about when we're talking about wiring, wiring things.
Wiring also includes getting it so establishing internet in there. So we'd be bringing fiber, which isn't available in the building now, and that's one of the biggest things is upgrading it to fiber so that we could get all of our departments hooked up on our same internet line.
So I want to point out a few things. One, check out Tom's tone in this discussion. It's very calm, very peaceful. Everyone seems to be getting along. He's just asking honest questions. We all know what winds up happening as this conversation quickly dissolves into chaos.
All in favor?
Aye.
Whoa! Please be respectful in the audience.
I have the floor. Thank you.
Be respectful.
Robert's Rules of Order dictate discussion.
Robert's Rules of Order doesn't dictate anything.
You guys are Democrats and you guys are putting this stuff up? You're Democrats!
You're not here to
and I'm not
respect
going to buy
the rule
it
of law.
by giving
You're
it to
not here to
Gentile
respect
or
transparency.
anybody else.
It's your agenda and nobody else's. The biggest mistake I ever made in politically was voting for you.
Good. This is how you want to work for the town, right? Keep yelling. This matter. Sir, did you...
But I want everyone to see that this wasn't originally the case, that both sides of the aisle were coming at this from a neutral position. The other thing I want to point out is that Tom eventually does become skeptical that $225,000 is going to actually cover the cost of this entire project.
So to loop this back to the comment that came earlier, you're talking about a $3 a square foot renovation on a 75,000 square foot building, and we really think that we're not going to reach into our pockets in the next 2 to 3 years for a couple $1 million to fix this building?
Cue montage of expenses incurred in addition to that $225,000 and expenses that we should expect to incur.
Motion to approve the proposal by Green Cap Advisors LLC to perform Phase 1 analysis of heating, cooling, and power upgrades at JPCC. $14,800 for Phase 1 funding for this project. Motion to approve a disbursement of $155,000 from the Waste Management Fund to pay for lighting required by the Zoning Commission.
Second. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?
$400,000 for sidewalks.
For that kitchen itself, we're looking to raise $100,000.
Next is discussion and possible action on the request for transfer of funds of $8,600 to repair the JPCC boiler number 1.
So moved.
What is the current condition of the boiler? What's the useful life that it has left? And what's the estimated cost of replacement?
I'm going to tell you about another 5 years, logically. And in terms of replacement costs, I think you're looking at upwards of hundreds of thousands of dollars.
This is an estimate based on what it's going to take to get us into this building today. I don't know where a couple of $1 million is going to come from. If I thought it was going to cost that much, I'd come to you now with that number rather than later.
The problem, Dave, is that Pete Bass came to you with that number months ago. And knowing even what we knew then, there's good reason to be skeptical about that $225,000 covering the total cost of this project.
I'm in the building contracting business. We look at schools. Yeah, I am. I'm a building performance contractor. I just audited 17 parishes for the Diocese of Bridgeport. I've looked at 18 schools and 50 buildings for them in the last 7 months. And I can tell you, for a little tiny footprint like St. Joseph's School, which we're about to start in the spring, $225,000 is a drop in the bucket to put on a roof, to get the building the mechanicals up. I'm not trying to be argumentative with you. All I want to know is, as somebody stated earlier, I have no problem you turning this into a community center. I'm beyond what it was in the past, okay? But all I'm looking for is there should be a committee of people like the turf committee, like the library modernization committee, like every other committee that this town starts, just to go over to make sure we're not screwing this up, Dave. I'm not looking for anything else.
So I don't know if everyone caught that, but what we're realizing at this point is that Dave Groenbeck can no longer be trusted to just handle this project himself. Of course, we should have known that given that he doesn't have a specialized expertise in this field. Perhaps Tom Esposito does, but the point is, at this point, if we're not going to hire a general contractor, we really need a committee to review this process. So the obvious question is, why is Dave so obtusely opposed to establishing a committee to oversee this project?
You can have a committee that lasts 20 years and nothing happens.
So, how much are we paying the committee? What if the right thing to do is nothing at all?
We need this to get done now.
Says who? Please don't be making the case that democratic solutions and devolution of power are a bad thing because absolute monarchies and dictatorships are more efficient. That's a terrible argument, King David.
I have an empty building that needs to get either occupied
or sold.
Or
sold.
Closed up and mothballed.
Or sold. I know you refuse to say it, but the alternative to get occupied is not get abandoned. It's selling the damn building, you jagaloon. Those are your two options.
I mean, one of the other options that wasn't mentioned, aside from you mentioned mothballing, is it could be sold.
You don't say. So Dave goes on to reiterate the fact that the reason he wants to do this is to fulfill a campaign promise and nothing else. And is willing to do so at all costs, even if that means abandoning any sort of governmental or process ethic upon which this country, and certainly at least this town, was founded. 5, 6, 7, 8. So let's go ahead and let Tom calmly address the claim that if he had set up a committee, this process would have been needlessly stalled.
If you had actually instituted or filled that committee the day you got elected, which is almost a year ago, okay, within 6 months, which would have been 5 months ago, we would have had the answer.
Paul Zemansky then asks a ton of industry-specific and technical questions that are not only relevant but absolutely pertinent to the grander project, which Dave not only can't answer, but refuses to answer and claims are totally irrelevant. Here's the short version.
Mr. Pooter took the time to write these questions, which I never even considered. I would appreciate it if we took the time to answer his questions.
Sure. Well, let's vote, and then I'm going to address these questions as I go forward in the project.
This is the point of no return. This is where Dave has said in no uncertain terms that he is unwilling to get obvious, pertinent information, and he's only willing to answer legitimate questions about the expenditure after the expenditure is approved. Well, then why answer those questions? What's precluding you from just saying, buzz off, I've got the money, you approved it, I'm spending it? This is the fundamental flaw in Dave's unbelievable understanding of process. You answer these questions, then you vote. Not only is this the point in which Dave Groenbach lost his own voting base and, I think, lost his election, this is also the exact moment when this issue went from something to talk about and ask serious questions about to a point of no return political football. So perhaps this is hindsight, but this is the point for me where I can no longer trust Dave Groenbach to oversee this process in a democratic manner. Now, I don't know if the 4 Republicans on town council at that moment felt that way, but there are serious and legitimate concerns that they had, and Paul Zemansky, I think, summarizes exactly what those concerns are and exactly why they were not going to vote to approve this expenditure.
I just want to say for the record, I will not be supporting this motion. I think it's too premature without having the costs associated with the Board of Ed to know what the true costs associated with the project are. The fact that we do not have zoning approval, which may add extra costs to the project, like a sidewalk or landscaping. We're holding a very small landscaping number. And the fact that I don't think this has been a very clear process with scope well defined. I think that tonight there were more questions than answers. For me to support an expenditure on that facility, I want to know not only the immediate expenses, but I want to know the long-term expenses. And I want to see a comparison between what it costs currently to upgrade the existing spaces to be utilized to what they need. For instance, everyone keeps saying that we're in violation of the ADA at East Street School, but there's not been a change of the use there since 1990 when ADA was created. So I'm still unaware of what actual violation there is. But I would like an honest assessment of both facilities. And like Katie said, we should have all options on the table. And this is the first night we've gotten actual pricing, although it's been discussed for months. And I just think it's too premature.
Fair enough.
I concur.
So just so everyone knows, I included that clip because, like I said, I'm trying to inform everybody on exactly how this process came to be and what has informed me to come to my conclusion so far in this process. So that's where we are now. That's what the 4 Republicans on the town council think. And all of this is acting to inform my opinion at the time. Now, here's where I'm going to inject Nick Pooter's public comment on that night. Now, public comment obviously comes long before the motions are even made and long before the discussion that we've seen so far. But I wanted everyone to see that, well, Nick Pooter raises these concerns before town council does, and there are certain concerns that he raises that aren't explicitly stated by the town councilman. And to be honest, even though he presented after I did, I think this speech alone had the greatest influence, in my opinion, on this entire project, and I think summarizes with near perfection all of the concerns of those parties who are concerned, not only up to this point, but throughout the majority of this process. I think it's so brilliantly well put that I'm actually going to include the entire commentary. So, folks, enjoy.
Thank you. I'm Nick Pooter. I live at 228 Marial. I'm here to speak about the Pettibone School project that you're contemplating. And I generally support this idea of a community center, but I have a number of questions about this. And my questions come from some experience I had building a similar project for the town of Phillipstown in New York State, where I worked as a consultant on the project. And it was a 1950s vintage school, similar sized site, with a fairly extensive program that the community asked for, but the pricing for that was way off base from what I think you're looking at here, and what you're asking for tonight. And that project did go to $15 million. So I'm urging this committee, this council, to think about some of these questions as you proceed down this path and weigh these decisions very carefully. And a few of the questions I have are, have you conducted, many of these have been stated already tonight, have you conducted a survey of residents to determine what types of facilities and activities they actually even desire in a rec building? Is there any indication in the Board of Ed or Parks and Rec budgets or the Plan of Conservation Development that's identified a need to shift these buildings, these offices out of the downtown? Has a fiscal analysis been conducted to compare the operational and maintenance costs of the current buildings versus the estimated operational and maintenance costs of the Pettibone building? If only 15,000 square feet, these are approximate numbers I understand, but 15,000 square feet, and I think the building's about 75,000 total, is to be used in this first phase, who's going to pay to heat the rest of that building, and is it really efficient to move now when you're only using about 20 or 25% of the building? How does this integrate with the current senior center? The budget amount that you're asking for, this $220 some odd thousand, from my calculations, is about $3 a square foot, and I think for adaptive reuse of a building of this size and this age, that's considerably understated. And I think somebody else has mentioned that maybe this is the first phase, but I would really urge you to develop a clear scope of work so you know what you're getting into before you go out and spend money on this. For other similar projects in the community, such as the library and the high school turf fields, which for the record I opposed, those projects had a steering committee of community members and members, I believe, of this council who worked together to establish a scope and keep records and keep the public informed. And the turf committee was incredibly well organized. They had meticulous records. They had wonderful minutes. They kept everybody informed. They came in on budget. They had a tremendous construction schedule and did a phenomenal job keeping everybody up to date on what was going on there. I would urge this group to consider forming that committee before you proceed down this path. Has a fiscal analysis been conducted to assess the potential value to the town if the property was sold? One of the previous speakers said something about $11 million. That's going to buy you a lot of space somewhere else. And what is the potential value, not only in sales price, but future tax revenue of selling that versus keeping it? Has an analysis been conducted to determine the true marketability of the existing town buildings in the downtown, where we already have a tremendous amount of vacancy? Can you even sell them or can you lease them out? And lastly, what is the ripple down effect on local merchants and moving town offices out of a downtown that's already seeing a lot of vacancy? I don't have a problem building a community center. I think it's a great idea. I think funding repairs at this stage in the game is premature. If you're serious about building a high quality resource here, please conduct the proper planning, proper research. Hire a consultant to lead you through. I'm not advocating. I'm not looking for a job here. But please conduct the proper planning and research before you're hiring people to go out and start work on this building. Thank you.
Okay, so we've reached the end of 2016, and I promised that I'd come back to the Board of Education side of this discussion and touch up on it. Well, in the fall of 2016, Grownback produced a Memorandum of Understanding for the Board of Education that they approved. In the winter of 2016 to 2017, a new memorandum was produced by Dave Grownback. This new Memorandum of Understanding radically changed the entire procedure, and importantly, radically changed the funding mechanism for their end of the project. The result was that in the winter of 2016-2017, the Board of Education unanimously rejected the new Memorandum of Understanding. And that's the point in which the Board of Education dropped the subject entirely, and we haven't heard back from them on that matter since. Like I said, I'll post a link to the 06776 podcast in this video's description, as well as the Board of Education's Vimeo page in this video's description. On the 06776 podcast, you can find audio recordings of the Board of Education subcommittee meetings that are pertinent to this conversation. And on the Board of Education's Vimeo page, you can find video recordings of their board meetings. So if you're really interested in the Board of Education side of this discussion, go ahead and check out the links in this description. To bring up Wendy Fallenbach's public comment from the very first video, this actually takes place before anything else I've shown you.
Good evening. My name is Wendy Fallenbach. I live at 76 Bonneview Lane. I'm humbled by all these comments this evening. I'm also a Board of Education member since 2001, 14 years, chairman of the Operations Committee. I must say that I'm surprised that this agenda for the council came with no conversations, at least I feel that way, at facilities, operations, or Board of Education meetings. When I saw this on the town council agenda, I immediately emailed the board chair and asked him why was this on the agenda and what conversations had taken place prior to this posting. His response was a link to the town website saying, ask the mayor. So I am here asking the mayor. I ask, why no conversations? Why hasn't this been before any of the subcommittees? You were gracious enough to give me an hour and a half of your time when I met with you in March regarding the capital reserve. At that time, I mentioned to you and urged you to come to our subcommittees to discuss issues and we can collaborate. You, as the mayor, are ex officio of the Board of Education. I saw you at the Q&A session for the budget forum, and we spoke briefly for 15 to 20 minutes outside about moving forward, working together. I believe that. But really, this is how it goes? We are still, to some degree, the custodians of the East Street School building. The Board of Education had to formally vote to relinquish both the old post office building and John Pettibone. The last legal opinion was sent to the Board of Education, dated February 27, 2015, and it stated that the board has custodial rights to a building even if we are using it as, quote, closet for storage. While it is unclear that that legal opinion may vary depending on this current building, this is not collaborative, and I don't feel it's appropriate. I look at this agenda as a preliminary eviction notice, and I think we can all do better as a town to collaborate. So I'm asking, did you work with the Board of Education? With whom at what level? What are the costs associated with a possible move? What is the time frame associated with a possible move? What is the long-term plan in establishing and funding this move? And why has the Board of Education been out of the loop? I was told by the chair to go ask the mayor, and so here I have. Thank you.
So I'm hoping you'll be able to see how at least one member of the Board of Education was way ahead of the curve. And I hope that video will help you understand exactly how this process is manifested and at least give some idea as to why this falling out happened between the Board of Education and Dave Grombach. All right, we're on to 2017. On April 24th, 2017, we had our next legislative action on the Community Center campaign promise.
Motion to authorize Mayor David R. Grombach to apply for and sign all necessary documents in connection with the Small Town Assistance Program STEEP grant. The grant request is in the amount of $500,000, and if secured, will be used and expended to improve the John Pettibone Community Center property.
I realize this grant allows us to do this work at no net cost, but that's not the point that Zemanski is about to make, which is that $500,000 just to repair the parking lot is a clear indicator that this project as a whole is going to cost a hell of a lot more than $225,000. The point is that $500,000 expenditure gives us an idea of scale.
So here's my concern, right? We started this discussion regarding Pettibone about 9 or 10 months ago. I think it was June of last year. And as a council, it was represented to us it was going to be less than $100,000, that we needed to do a roof repair, we needed to patch a boiler and replace the tank in the boiler. We're now here some months later. We've expended $225,000 through the waste management fund. We're now being told we haven't occupied the building. We're now being told that we need another $500,000 for pavement. That doesn't take into account the zoning approval process, which, based on the lighting plan I saw, is going to require new lighting, which zoning commission likely is going to require sidewalks because they're requiring that of everyone along Route 7. So I'm extremely disappointed because when we initially started this process, I asked flat out, it's in the minutes, is there going to be a plan? Is there going to be a budget? Are we going to look at what the true honest costs of the project are? And I was assured time and time again, the multiple times it got brought up at the town council, that it was going to be a de minimis amount of money. And here we are, $225,000 in, another $500,000 request just for pavement, and we still don't have a plan for how to pay for the sidewalks, potential landscaping, lighting, not to mention the building itself. We were told by Green Cap at the last meeting, their project doesn't include the roof. So As a councilman, I feel I've been misled, and I can't support this, because when we look at our wants versus our needs, I don't think this project's a need.
You would object to $500,000 from the state, not from the town, but from the state to pay for additional improvements and upgrades at the property. That's your objection, is that the state would actually pay for this, not the town, not the taxpayer, but the state.
No, my objection, Mayor.
No, you just said that. I want to be clear. You said
that's not
part of the budget. You know, it's but you're objecting to me asking for $500,000 from the state to make additional upgrades, and you're objecting to that.
Let me answer. My concern is, and what I'm objecting to, is the process.
Yeah.
We were told today that the grant's already been applied for, so the town council had no input of potentially modifying that. To me, that's my opinion, unacceptable. That's not working together.
Yeah, sure.
Secondly, as it relates to what I feel are priorities for projects in this town, no, I do not feel a project, which we were just told just for the paving, is $500,000. I think we need to reassess that whole project just based on this statement that was just made. I think we should apply for something like the economic development project of Still Meadows or Century Brass. And how could we do infrastructure improvements within that? To make it marketable, to make it sellable, to put it on the tax rolls. Those are, when you look at the awards over the last 10 years, those are the exact kind of projects that the STEEP's looking for.
Sure.
These creative, outside-the-box economic development projects that other towns don't think of. Yeah. And when we think of that over other towns, all of a sudden people start talking about the town saying, hey, how did they come up with that? Those guys think outside the box.
Well, Kathy, do you have something to
Well, it
add?
would probably be a good idea is if we start thinking about that for the next round of STEEP grants. We didn't have much time to put this together. It was after the last town council meeting before. I suppose I don't know if they do have it every year. Okay, so we'll make sure that we plan ahead and we do a better job planning ahead with it.
I think we did a great job. So we'll let the council set the priorities. So all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? 2 opposed.
So I don't know if everyone caught that very subtle slight at the very end of that clip, but it appears as though Grumbeck is about to continue this conversation and at least attempt to answer some of Zemansky's questions, but then very abruptly calls the vote and doesn't ask if there's any further discussion. Now, it's not always necessary to ask if there's any further discussion, but this is a very abrupt call of the vote. In fact, he calls the vote apparently mid-sentence. It's as though at this point he's realized that he's got his 5 votes. He can just do whatever he wants and has no reason to answer any of these questions. For me, this is when I've seen the full evolution from elected mayor to outright monarch. Now, I'll very quickly also mention that it was this meeting in which Green Cap Advisors was hired to conduct a Phase 1 survey of the energy consumption over at Pettibone and to make a projection of what the energy consumption of that facility would be should we bring on Green Cap Advisors to help us reduce our energy consumption at that facility, should it also be then converted into a community center. The Phase 1 survey was an expenditure of $14,800. We saw that in the montage. I mention that now because we're going to bring them back later on in the video, and it'll make no sense at that point if we don't have this disclaimer first. Paul Zemansky's concern, which I think is the common concern among those who are actually concerned with the process, is his concern with the process, not the expenditure itself. And as proof of that, here's a clip of Paul Zemansky throwing his support for an almost identical expenditure, but for the library modernization project.
A couple things. One, I'm extremely encouraged by the fact that you guys went to the community. I think that's overlooked many times. The fact that you reached out to them in multiple ways through the media, whether it was print, online, email, and by mail, and including them in the process, I think helps make the project the best that it can be. And it helps get buy-in because everyone has the opportunity to comment before the decisions are made. So if anyone becomes opposed to the project down the road, you gave them that opportunity to present that opposition or to present their comments, critiques, etc. To me, that's extremely important.
On June 26, we had our next major expenditure for Pettibone of $155,000 for parking lot lighting. There's really not much to discuss in this June 26 meeting, but I think it's important for everybody to see it just to keep track of where we are so far and how much we've spent on this project.
Motion to approve a disbursement of $155,000 from the Waste Management Fund to pay for lighting required by the Zoning Commission.
Second. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?
Now, I should also mention briefly, this is the town council meeting at which Mike Barnes makes his public comment that is absolutely scathing about this entire process. I'll upload that video in a moment, and I'll post a link to that video in this video's description once I get that video uploaded. It's absolutely scathing and brutally honest in its take on the matter, and I think actually informed my decision on the matter as well. And the truth is, I really love the clip, but it's largely redundant with what Nick Pooter has said, and injects a little bit more opinion than I think is necessary for this video. But most importantly, it's redundant, and this video is already getting really, really long. So instead, I'll just show a section of what Greg Mullins said during public comment on June 12, 2017, because I think it really summarizes what I've been saying about our fears about Dave Gromback's understanding of proper governance and democratic processes.
My opinions are not as important as what the people's opinions are, and I don't think an election or an elected member is a license to do what you want without a broad input from across the community.
All right, so we're on to September 11, 2017, and boy, what a town council meeting that was. As it relates to this video, there was a motion to approve $40,000 to bring on Green Cap Advisors to begin their Phase 2. Now, it's really not important what Phase 2 is, but they're going to be making a presentation based on what they found from Phase 1, and that's what's pertinent to the information for this video. So, we spent a lot of money in this project. We spent a lot of time on this project. There are a lot of concerns that have been brought up. There are a lot of questions that have been brought up, and not a whole lot of answers. So I think the viewers, at least at home watching this video, are due a summary of where we are, an account of the events so far, including expenditures, actual activity, and the concerns of the voting public so far. Lisa Heda does this brilliantly during public comment at the June 26, 2017 meeting.
Tonight, I'm going to change the subject from our earlier conversations. I'm going to ask the town council to table the request that's on the agenda for additional appropriations for the renovation of the property formerly known as John Pettibone School. I do this not because I'm opposed to the idea of a community center. I'm not. But because I believe as stewards of our community, it's up to us to make sure, number one, we as a town can afford it, and number two, that we design it the way the taxpayers want. This is really important right now for a number of reasons. Our grand list isn't increasing. That's not new news. There's a high degree of uncertainty how much funding we're going to get to the state, from the state. I've heard a number as big as $10 million worth of cuts. That's not insignificant. School enrollment is down, causing further concern about funding sources. We borrowed $14 million in April to cover capital expenses and ongoing costs that were already incurred. Other hard choices were made in the budget. Nonprofits were cut by 30%. The question is simple. How much is this project going to cost our town in total, and is it appropriate for this time? Right now, we've spent, as far as I can tell, $394,500 have been appropriated for a project that was touted, I believe, earlier this spring to cost $100,000 or less. So specifically, I'm asking town council members, represent me, represent my interests and interests of like-minded taxpayers such as myself. Table this appropriation until we have a comprehensive design, a total project cost for the entire building, a complete timeline, a study of the economic impact to the village green and the downtown businesses. I don't believe that that has been done. A project justification that's up to date based upon departmental space needs and future plans. For my corporate life, we would have never considered a facilities addition without looking at the space needs and requirements, not just for the current year, but for 5 and 10 years down the road. And last but not least, significant outreach to receive community input. And here's what I don't understand. We know how to do this. It's the same thing I said to the zoning board 6 weeks ago. We as a town know how to run this process. The library expansion is a great success story. There was a process, there was a design, there was community input, and everybody's rallying behind it. So we know how to do this.
So yes, we spent $394,000 so far with no end in sight. This is the concern with not having a master plan. This is why those who are opposed to spending another $40,000 on Green Cap Advisors are concerned about spending another $40,000 on Green Cap Advisors. Pete Mullen doesn't seem to understand this, as indicated by his public comment on that same night.
We spent $4 million on turf fields, and we can't spend 1/10 of that for a community center?
This isn't the issue. You've missed the point entirely. The point is that we spent $394,800 with no master plan. What happens if this winds up costing more than $4 million? We have no way of knowing that is or isn't going to be the case until we've completed a master plan. It's like paying for a house piecemeal. Yeah, the foundation may only cost you $30,000, But how much does the framing cost? How much does the roofing cost? How much do windows and doors cost? How much does siding and trim cost? And that's just the exterior facade. You don't pay for these sort of things piecemeal, and you especially don't pay for them piecemeal and complain when people are wondering what the total project cost is going to be. Again, Pete Bass presented a capital expenditure plan of just over $2 million over a year ago, and it's seeming more and more like we're going to be closing in on that number. Now, very quickly, I do have to address a little bit of a fallacy that Andy Grossman's about to present that is still persisting to this day, and that's the only reason I'm going to quickly address this.
I saw one figure that was $10 to $15 million.
So I'm sure you all can tell that I've done a ton of research for this video, and I can't seem to find anywhere where anyone argued that this project was going to cost $10 to $15 million. It seems as though the person that made that argument was a straw man. So if you can point me to video of people saying that this project is actually going to cost $10 to $15 million, kind of like I've been doing this entire video, please do put it in the comments section of this video. And for the record, just because somebody suggested that another project cost $15 million doesn't mean they're suggesting that this one actually is going to cost $15 million, especially if the argument is strictly a matter of scale. It's strictly a matter of presenting that $15 million number for that other project to indicate that a few $100,000 isn't going to satisfy this project. And on that note, let's naturally segue to some of the operating expenses we can expect to incur as presented by GreenCap Advisors.
We transition from a school use to an office use, the electric consumption goes up. So even if you use the same 3 seasons, your electric consumption would be higher, your energy consumption would be higher. When you extrapolate that 68% higher use that we talked about earlier, the school, and you turn it from a 3-season to a 4-season, and from a school use to an office use, that 115 becomes $205,000 a year.
Okay, so increased energy costs of $90,000 alone after they've completed their project to reduce our energy consumption in that building.
The other thing we did, and again, it's not addressed in this summary here, is that in both scenarios, we incorporated a new roof. Okay, so that's equal. It worked out, we had a couple of contractors come in, and that worked out to be in the $1 million range. Anywhere from $950 to $1.2 million were the estimates we got as part of that. So having been up on the roof ourselves and seeing the condition of the roof, I'm not a roofer, but my sense is that the roof needs to be replaced.
Okay, Dave, so that's now 2 specialists, at least in this field, that have told you that not only does the roof need to be replaced over at Pettibone, it's going to cost you roughly $1 million. So in response to you hurling back that capital plan that Pete Bass presented to you over a year ago in June of 2016.
But listen, I will get you a budget. I don't need.
How do you feel about that now that the consulting firm that you brought to town council and recommended for approval has told you to your face the roof needs to be replaced and it's going to cost a rough $1 million? Okay, now we move ahead. One town council meeting, and I'm just going to briefly mention the fact that I reintroduced what I now call the Taylor Protocol. That was my suggestion of using Taylor's as an alternative for the community center rather than Pettibone.
My mind's not closed to anything yet.
So again, I'll post a link to the Taylor Protocol in the description of this video, and I recommend everybody checking it out. Okay, so 2017 comes to a close and we get a whole new administration, and one of the first things this new administration does is establish a community center committee.
Next, discussion and possible action regarding the recommendation to establish an ad hoc committee consisting of 25 members for a duration of 6 months, beginning on 1/22/18, ending 7/23/18, to report back to the mayor and town council on the following: study the feasibility of a community center in New Milford, the community center's composition, operational structure, and finances, any steps needed to legally accomplish the creation of a community center. So this committee would be charged with seeing what opportunities were there for the composition, the structure, and finances. And then anything legally we needed to do to create the community center. So we have full public input on this, which is what the people wanted.
Okay, notice the deliberate exclusion of the words John or Pettibone. This is deliberate, and the reason is because do we need a community center? What is a community center? Does it have to be at John Pettibone? We haven't answered these questions yet, and any committee that's going to be looking at this project for a community center has to answer those questions, so you don't want to bias the committee by in any way delivering in any part of their charge any mention of the words John or Pettibone. All right, so the 25-member committee gets formed and the positions are filled in February. At the first meeting, I present this workflow chart. I'll put a link in this video's description to a video of me making that presentation, but the basic idea should be relatively self-evident. I want to point out that this was not supposed to be a complete work process, but just something to get them started. Note that one of the first things in this workflow is how do we define a community center? Note that it's become obvious at this point that we don't have this definition, and I'm not the only one to make this point. This has now become the common concern of those involved. Again, I'll post a link to that video in this video's description, so if you're interested, check it out. All right, so later on in that very same meeting, January 22nd, 2018, the council approves another $8,600 on that facility to repair the boiler in that facility. Paul Zemansky asks the obvious questions about life expectancy and replacement costs.
What is the current condition of the boiler? What's the useful life that it has left? And what's the estimated cost of replacement?
The condition, I'll say, is fair. I think, you know, they're serviceable boilers. I think there's some maintenance items that need to be done. Going forward, I don't think anything extravagant that we're seeing just yet. They're aging. However, they're, I said, I think they're serviceable for, I'm going to tell you about another 5 years, logically. And in terms of replacement costs, I think you're looking at upwards of hundreds of thousands of dollars.
So, yes, we do need to replace those boilers in the near future. This isn't something you could put off indefinitely, and it is going to cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Reiterating Pete's point from the very beginning that this process will likely cost not a few $100,000, but probably closer to that $2 million that Pete suggested from the very first meeting. Okay, fast forward to June 25th, 2018. Jeff Winter, as vice chair of the Community Center Committee, makes his update to the town council.
The charge really was to determine whether or not New Milford wants a community center, and if New Milford wants a community center, what would they like to see in the community center? So it's very, what you bring up is very important, because the chair and I have tried to stress repeatedly throughout our meetings that it is not about the building, a building, what have you. That's not it. And believe me, it's hard to get that out of people's heads. When I say that, even members of the committee, they're all like, well, we can do this and this, and we're like, no, can't do that. It's all about what the community needs.
Okay, so notice how Jeff acknowledges that the bias we just described is causing serious problems with their market research's statistical validity. And it's for this reason that the community center has begun to approach the town council for an appropriation for funds to hire an outside market research firm to conduct this research for them. Lisa Hita explains quite succinctly why you not only need that outside research, but goes one step further and explains why this research should be conducted with an extremely narrow focus. And I'll add that what she says provides a rationale for not relying on the POCD for this research.
In front of us, we've got three big projects, if you will. We were a company, right? We've got this project, vitally important, could be somewhere between $5 and $15 million if you look at benchmarking. We've got the Bike and River Trail, and we've got Riverfront. So the first piece to me, from my background in market research, is you don't want to mix your market research. Because if you do, and you try to make it one size fits all, you're not going to get good answers to the questions. So the community center question and the potential target audience is different than the Bike and River Trail, because that's a different purpose, and the Riverfront Revitalization, which is more economic development as opposed to recreation or community center. So I wouldn't mix those market research projects.
I just wonder if we asked, we started with this because it was that big elephant in the town.
Yep.
And I just wonder if we hadn't started there and we were talking about market research to see who wants what in their community, where would we go?
You're going to get dilution and not good answers. I am biased towards market research independent, because then you can't refute the results. And this has been such a hot topic. Let's get some good results and have them non-refutable and do the best thing for the community.
Lisa?
So that's why my recommendation is to have them go find out how much it would cost and bring that back with their data.
And that's generally the consensus of the town council. Come back with 3 estimates of what it's going to cost to get this market research done from an outside firm, along with your final presentation. So just very briefly, on July 9th, 2018, the Community Center Committee was supposed to make their presentation, but unfortunately they were unable to get a quorum and couldn't have any meetings between that June meeting and when they were supposed to make their presentation on July 9th, 2018. So in order to help them get a quorum, they reduced the number of people on the committee from 25 to 17 and gave them an extension of 6 months. Okay, so we've kind of dissolved this conversation. At first, we were talking about what it's going to cost to convert Pettibone into a community center. What we are now realizing is we don't know what a community center even is, so we need to answer that question. This is going to become really important right now because we're about to skip to September 10th, 2018, when the Community Center Committee makes their formal presentation to the Town Council. The conversation to this point has basically led us to the establishment of this committee, and to the need for the establishment of this committee, and for the need to rely on the input from this committee to conduct an awful lot of research and answer an awful lot of serious concerns and questions. We're going to now take a really concerned look at the presentation that the leadership for this group is going to produce, and this will form the central and focal point of my concluding remarks. So we're going to jump ahead in this presentation to when the chairs start discussing the former community center that existed on Church Street many decades ago.
So the community center, we wondered, why is New Milford the only town to close a community center? Well, it turns out it was the lack of will on part of the town, public entities, and volunteers.
So we're going to address this more in just a bit, but using the phrase lack of will implies one of 2 things. Either you didn't do your research because this statement begs the question, why was there a lack of will? Or you're implying some sort of malfeasance because there should have been some sort of will, which is particularly worrying because that implies there's more benefit than cost to a community center, and in particular, this one. Like I said, we'll come back to this in a bit, so just hang on to that thought.
So we do have a senior center here. In some towns, the senior center is what they consider a community center. Our town serves the seniors very well, but it only provides for the seniors. So it's, in some towns it may be the community center, but here it doesn't work that way. We have a large generational gap in town that only the seniors are served at the senior center.
So what makes those community centers a community center? You said the Richmond Center isn't a community center and provided exactly one disqualifier, but why is that disqualifier a disqualifier? We don't have a definition for a community center, which means you can't say the Richmond Center is or is not a community center a priori. But that's exactly what you've done. Again, we'll come back to this in a bit because this statement is just part of a much larger problem.
There are truly multiple definitions of what a community center is, and multiple ways in order to organize how those services are provided. There is no one single way to do it. Among the towns, of the 30 towns we looked at, the community centers varied in size from 800 square feet to 50,000 square feet.
So again, Jeff Winder acknowledges that there are multiple definitions of a community center. And by the way, the range of 800 square feet to 50,000 square feet is a huge range. So you can see just how important it is to define what exactly a community center is, because that could mean a huge range in investment costs.
Just to show you some examples here of what other towns have done recently in terms of investments. Wallingford renovated an office building. 50,000 square feet. It will include agencies and recreation at a cost of $2.3 million.
So John Pettibone is basically no more than an office building. And at almost exactly 50% larger than the Wallingford building, that should give you an idea of scale when it comes to the idea of converting the use of John Pettibone from a school to a community center. Again, I'm probably beating a dead horse at this point, but Pete Bass's estimate of just over $2 million is sounding more and more accurate with each day.
Now, Newington is unique for a few reasons, but the voters there approved $28.5 million to replace the town hall and many offices within town hall, as well as community center.
Okay, so it's a little bit off topic, but I know the question's going to come up, so this should give you a bit of an idea of scale when it comes to a project like that. Of course, the real reason I included that clip is to give context for this next clip.
But what's interesting about that is that the voter support was nearly 2-to-1 in favor. And how often do you see almost anything receive voter support at a 2-to-1 margin?
Well, Jeff's making this statement on September 10th, 2018, so it's probably unfair to say this, but how about right here in New Milford, less than 60 days ago, when we voted on a scale of 7,780 to 3,290 to approve the library modernization project? That's a ratio of roughly 2.4 to 1, which is substantially more than 2 to 1. But that's not the point. The point is, why is this statement relevant? Jeff doesn't go on to explain why this is relevant, so the logical conclusion is that this is relevant, again, a priori, which means that the voters were right to decide the way they did, and so should New Milford voters. Again, and I feel like a broken record on this, we'll come back to this in a bit, so hang on to that thought.
The key finding is that a majority of residents, roughly 80%, expressed a desire for a community center in New Milford. What's significant about this is that this data is nearly the same as the 72% desire for a community center recorded back in the 2010 Plan of Conservation and Development. This adds validity to both the 2010 study as well as the survey done this year.
No, Jeff, that's not what statistical validity means. You don't add validity. Either the results and methodology were valid or they weren't. Also, you provided two arguments from authority as a source of statistical validation. That's not how that works. If you're referring to replicability of results, research that was conducted prior to your results couldn't possibly have been instituted to test your hypothesis and to determine if your results were replicable. But that all misses the point entirely anyways. If the methodology of testing the hypothesis is, for example, biased, the results are thus invalid. The same would be true if the results themselves were tainted or if the methodology included a critical flaw, such as a miscalibrated measuring device. Validity refers to how well the results prove or disprove the hypothesis, and how well the conclusions of the results can be relied upon in the real world. What statistically invalid results means is you can't do anything with the results except to throw them all away. Again, we'll revisit this in a bit, but it's clear that this group doesn't understand statistical validity. Sadly, this isn't common knowledge, so I'll post a link to the Wikipedia article for statistical validity in the description of this video. Warning, this is not an easy read, and there's a reason this isn't common knowledge.
And this is that key question. I think New Milford needs a community center. Again, this is a pretty strong response, and again, it aligns very well with what was done in 2012.
Okay, if this is how the 2012 survey was conducted, then they are both statistically invalid. I said we'd revisit this previous clip, and here we are. When you're trying to determine a binary conclusion, you don't just ask the test subjects to tell you what conclusion to draw. I plan to go on a whole tirade on this matter, but I'll just say that this is what's called subject bias. And the way you remove this type of bias from your results is with the use of blinds. Wikipedia calls this the subject expectancy effect, and I'll put a link to that article in this video's description. Most specifically, this question is what's called a leading question, and in statistics, that term varies a little bit from the legal definition. But enough with technical terms, allow me to allow Lisa Hida to explain this all in layman's terms, and what exactly you're supposed to do with research that's based on questions with this type of bias.
If you ask any customer in any service or hard manufactured product industry what they want in a new product, they'll say lower price, better quality. When you ask people if they want a community center, they're going to say yes until they know the price tag. So what I'd like to see in a market research firm, and again, I know I'm kind of waving the banner by myself here, it's a very specific type of research called conjoint analysis, where you mix the features and benefits and price points in such a way that you can't lead your market survey recipients to any one conclusion.
So I said I was going to be speaking towards a larger problem, and I'll get to that in a moment, but this next clip is probably the final straw in that matter.
What's interesting is that when you look what the people asked for or what they sought, it drives right back to what our town had as a community center in the 60s and 70s. Educational opportunities, recreational opportunities for youth, those desires really haven't changed. It's just that our town dropped the ball.
What do you mean, drop the ball? This sounds like a wildly inappropriate injection of opinion into an entirely empirical research study report. Yet again, we'll come back to this in a minute, But there's another question to be asked here, and Paul Zemansky is the one to ask it.
You're saying our community center closed in 1979 or whatever it was.
Right.
It didn't close, it relocated, right?
No.
You have Mariel Center for the Arts, which does
That
the
was
performing.
separate. That was founded in 1951 as still
Private.
a private entity.
So it was our community center was private, not run by the town?
No, Mariel is private.
Correct, but that serves certain functions of what our community center previously did. You said we had an orchestra and, no. So it says located at 29 Church Street. Parks and Rec was the first agency to occupy the community center. We
Yes.
still have a Parks and Rec, right?
Yes.
Okay. Then it says programs offered to all ages and provided various experiences. Youth programs including sports. We do have Parks and Rec and Youth Agency, which serves that purpose, correct?
Oh, yeah.
Yes,
Absolutely.
but they were not all together at the same time.
So what you're saying is because they're not
Up
in one
until about
location,
2 years
it doesn't
ago,
count?
Parks and Rec was down on Bridge Street, and the Youth Agency was in East Street. They were not together. They were not in a community center. Now they are.
Okay, so I guess my question is, are the functions of the community center in 1979 still performed today by various town agencies? Oh, let me just keep going because I'm just going through your slides because you say arts and crafts. I mean, doesn't the youth agency have that with our youth? And doesn't the rec portion of our Parks and Rec do that through their classes?
Yes, in the
Okay.
community center.
Look, if you want to say all of the functions, I don't see us hosting any law classes. I don't see us hosting any typing classes. I don't see us hosting any computer classes and things of that sort. Now, again, the Board of Ed money. But again, these are the things that.
Oh, the senior center does. They offer those. They offer typing. They offer the computer classes. The library also offers those classes.
What does a 35-year-old person do?
Adult education.
They go to the library.
No,
The library offers the similar courses, Jeff. And then if you look at the Board of Ed, they have an adult ed program that offers many of those same courses as well.
That's Board of Ed. That's not the community center.
But if the town's offering it,
Okay.
Yeah, but hold on, so I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think this is an interesting point. And again, I understand it's an interim report, and thank you for your work. One of the things going forward, when you come up with the final compilation, is will there be cannibalization from other entities and programs, and you have to offset that with then what the final square footage needs and the overall program needs are. So just tuck that away for consideration for the final report.
So you're essentially referring to like synergies between departments?
You can call them synergies or cannibalization, which one,
Okay.
but there's only so much in the population, and if you offer the same, I think we've run into this in some departments. If two departments are offering the same program, there's only so many people who are gonna sign up, and then we end up with extra costs and non-sustainability, so just think about that.
It looks like New Milford provides almost the largest amount of services out of any of the towns that you guys surveyed. I guess your concern is just that the services aren't centralized together?
That's part of it, but also, like Lisa mentioned, the synergy between the different agencies and groups that are there. I mean, they've never had that before.
So, excuse me, clarification, I did not mention synergies, I said be careful in your analysis to think about cannibalization of programs and don't double count them. Sorry, let's be clear about what I said.
So what services did that community center originally provide? And how are they provided in our community today? Are they not provided at all? Are they still provided in some fashion? Also, the fact that the leadership of this group doesn't understand the term cannibalization as it refers to market research is a clear indicator that this group can't be trusted to perform that research. Further, and this is probably more important, the emphatic and deliberate effort to reference Pettibone as a community center which satisfies the needs referenced shows an inability to understand the significance of performing this research without the preconception that Pettibone satisfies the definition of a community center. This exchange continues for some time. Paul Zemansky brings up a service at the community center from the 60s provided and a complementary service provider today. What this should tell you right away is that the type of questions they should have been asking in their original survey would be questions like, how many times a month do you use an exercise facility? How many times a year do you play basketball? How many times per month do you play organized sports? Do you have a gym membership? Not, do you think a community center should include a gym?
If Pettibone was still a school, if it hadn't been decommissioned as a school, all of these comments, all of these nonprofits, all of these things we're talking about, if they're bursting at the seams, they would have at some point had to find another alternative. Paul makes a wonderful point. New Milford has fantastic programs, particularly for kids. Our youth agency does a wonderful job. So does Parks and Rec. All months of the year, along with the Pratt Center and Village Center of the Arts and all these others. So if we're doing such a good job, why does it have to all be combined? Because we have this building? That's really the cart before the horse. Is just because you have an empty space, does that mean you have to put things together? And that's where I see the fallacy or the problem in all of this. There's nothing wrong with your data or whatever, however you want to manipulate it. But I just say, can't we just forget for a minute that that building is there and approach what you're doing as if there was nothing?
Dead on, Katie Francis. This research should be conducted as though there is no community center in New Milford. This is how you remove that bias that's going to be referenced later on in this video by not only me, but other members of the town council. And to address a more specific point that Michelle Ligori made, Lisa Hita brings up the concept of centralization versus decentralization.
One of the things we need to add to Katie's point is centralized versus decentralized. That has not been your charge, centralized or decentralized. You've looked at other building options, so I want you to think about that as part of your charge.
And that's our last bullet point right there.
It doesn't say centralized versus decentralized. That's a very specific thing because that then gets around the bias of the current building versus other buildings.
So it talks about new versus existing and mix of services. That's your
So again, that's, if you said that to a market research firm without the history, they may not understand that that's the contention. So I want to be very literal about that with it.
Okay, so jump ahead to the town council meeting of September 24th, 2018. This is the meeting in which Dakota Partners presents their LOI, letter of intent, to buy East Street School since it has been listed for roughly a year at this point. The reason we were considering listing this property in the first place was as part of that entire community center discussion, that this could be a source of capital should this project require that capital. Of course, so could the sale of John Pettibone, and this is what's called an opportunity cost. So at that meeting, I presented what opportunity cost is and gave an example as to why it's important to make that consideration when making a cost-benefit analysis. So excuse me while I toot my own horn.
Tonight I want to talk about a term called opportunity cost. Opportunity cost is the benefit sacrificed by making one decision rather than another in competing decisions. I use the qualifier competing because when decisions are not in competition, there's no benefit sacrifice. To clarify, I'll use the example of the decision to employ, which is the most common manifestation of opportunity cost that is easily conceptualized. George is a landscaper. He owns his own business but has no employees. He can mow 20 lawns a week. He can also endeavor into chemical treatments, which is where the good money is, but he doesn't have the time during the week to take on this new line of work. So George is presented with a decision to make. He could hire Manny, or he could not. Hiring Manny has obvious direct and indirect costs, Manny's salary, the various insurances and taxes associated with hiring someone, but not hiring Manny has a cost of sacrificing the opportunity to take on new work. This is because George has excess human capital, but that's another term for another day. I'll try to give another example we might find more applicable to us today. George's business takes off. He buys a fairly large piece of property with 3 buildings on 3 parcels of land, all separate. One is where the main office is, one is where a 5-bay garage is, building 2, and the other is where a 16-bay garage is, building 3. George only needs 4 of the combined 21 bays, and after 6 months finds himself using 2 of the bays in each of building 2 and 3. He could easily consolidate into each of the buildings, but he obviously can't afford to sell both of the buildings. He gets an offer to buy building 2. That's the smaller one. Now he has a decision to make. There are obvious benefits to accepting the offer, but he shouldn't forget the opportunity costs, which may be to instead sell building 3. Building 3 is on a corner lot on a divided arterial highway at a stoplight and has 16 bays. Building 3 has real potential to sell for 10 times the offer on building 2. This is an enormous opportunity cost. Now, building 3 is big enough to hold all of building 2 and the main office, but that would only require a total of 7 bays and would mean more than doubling his productivity in very short order to justify the new occupancy, and would sacrifice the ease of access to complementary services on the side road adjacent to the main office, the sod farm across the street, which also has a mulch facility, the mechanic next door. He also would alienate the existing well-established client base, which appreciated the ergonomic entrance, the improved parking, etc. So I hope that when we're making decisions moving forward, when we're doing a proper cost-benefit analysis, we aren't forgetting what are called opportunity costs. Thank you.
So I admit I spoke in metaphors and euphemisms. So for those of you that didn't quite get what I was alluding to, thank you, Lisa Hida, for diving on the proverbial hand grenade.
Mike Sinello talked earlier about opportunity cost, and I think the elephant in the room is, for me anyway, if we move tonight on this LOI, then we've got to find a home for the people who are now in that building. There are big proponents that want to put them in another space in town that's being analyzed by a community committee to see if that's the right place for them. So the decision to me is not as simple as, do we believe in affordable housing? Is this the right thing? And is Dakota Partners the right company to help our town? I think you guys do a great job. But then the other question for me is, representing the taxpayers, is taking the 1.6 today plus the taxes versus giving up the potential to do things a little bit differently with buildings, maybe sell a different property for a lot more money. Which one's the better thing for the taxpayers? And I don't know the answer to that yet.
So update, again, this is, I think, the point at which the rest of the town council starts to understand the consideration of opportunity costs in this manner. And again, thank you, Katie Francis, for diving on the proverbial hand grenade and asking the most important question during Dakota Partners' presentation.
Did you ever approach our mayor or consider the other building, the elephant in the room building, the Pettibone building? You can put a lot of units in there.
Honestly,
You have a lot of parking too.
I know. Honestly, we didn't.
So you never did a assessment?
No, we were never directed there.
So if they were directed there, they might consider that property. Now again, one property has been appraised at way, way more than the other property, and I'll let you guess which one that is. All right, so we have to fast forward a little bit, and that's to November 26, 2018. That was the first meeting in which the town council formally decided whether or not to appropriate $18,500 in funds to hire an outside party to conduct the market research in question. I went over that in brutally pedantic detail in a prior video, and I'll post a link to that video in this video's description as well. All you need to know about that meeting for now is that Lisa Hida explained that the reason you need this research and the reason you need a third party to conduct the research is because there was a serious question of statistical validity in the results presented by the Community Center Committee. With 8 councilmen present, that decision came down to, folks, a tie. So this item appeared again on the December 10th, 2018 Town Council meeting agenda, and yes, there is a discussion to be had as to whether or not it was appropriate to include this item on the agenda for December 10th, 2018. But what's really important to note is that what was once a 4-4 tied decision became a 7-2 decision against. One of the votes that was flipped in this meeting was Lisa Hida's, and her explanation for flipping her vote, I think, is the seminal and deciding point in this entire process, and the point at which this process has begun to wrap up. If you get nothing else out of this ridiculously long diatribe, this 2.5 minutes of Lisa Hida is the thing you need to get out of this video.
Lisa?
Sorry to bring up what I've said at least half a dozen times again, but there's going to be a new twist, I promise. You can't, I appreciate that the Plan of Conservation and Development has community forums and asks questions and you can get to the heart of the matter. But the more you blur the lines about the different types of questions you want answered, the less clear your answers become. People get weary. So I'm still an advocate for doing a separate market research study. However, watching social media and reflecting on the meeting minutes from our previous town councils and when the committee has presented, I'm going to withdraw my support for having the committee do a market research study, and I'll tell you why. And this is nothing against, I know there have been several members of the committee that worked really, really hard and have done their best to try to move this forward. But the committee, select members of the committee, I apologize, have demonstrated confirmation bias time and time again. And when you do market research, if you have confirmation bias, you're going to get the answer you think you want to get. We've had leadership of that committee stand up here and say they want to see the community center in JPS full stop. That's confirmation bias. So as much as I think there are well-intentioned people, the discord that Pat spoke about in public comment about there being such a polarization of opinions on the committee and them not being able to come to consensus as best they could, I think we need to take that conflict out, give the committee direction to have them write their report where they are right now, and not spin their wheels. I said this last town council, let's not yank them around. Let's have them finish it up where they are and find a different way to get the market research done. I don't know where the money is going to come from, but we don't have it, or we think we don't have it. So let's move on. And there's another reason I'm very concerned about the bias, and it's a little bit of a stretch, but I'm going to go there. So if you look at, there's an attorney, Austin Wolf, who does land use and real estate law. And he talks about case law where when there is prejudice, townspeople have the right to overturn the decision of a commission or a committee. And I'm going to read a couple of paragraphs here from some of his opinions. Predisposition has no statutory basis and has evolved on a case-by-case basis. Predisposition means a predetermination of the issues by the authority. That is, showing that a board or commission has made up its mind, essentially decided before the public commitment. It's more difficult to establish predisposition than conflict of interest, but once proven, the result's the same. The action of the board or commission is deemed to be invalid. So let's not go down that path. I think the committee has bias. Select members of the committee have bias. I think others have great intention, but I don't want them to keep working and then just have it overturned at the end of the day. That's what I got.
Now, I really like the legal side of the argument that she presents, but that isn't the part that most informs my decisions on this matter. Do you remember what we talked about before with leadership presenting bias in their results and not being able to realize that they've presented it? Do you remember what I said about holding that thought when we were talking about how leadership didn't understand fundamental and paramount technical terms of the market research they were conducting? Now, I've talked about this clip with Lisa directly because I've watched it 30 or 40 times just to wrap my head around everything that she has to say because it is so dense. In 2.5 minutes, she pretty much puts a ribbon on this entire project, and there's a lot to digest. And she told me specifically not to put words in her mouth in this matter, but I wanted to let everyone know what my thoughts are on the matter now and moving forward. And since this video is probably the video that has most informed my decision as of late, I think it's important to tell people what I've gotten out of this video. There is bias built into this committee and they're incapable of realizing it. There is serious technical ability that is lacking in this committee to conduct the research that they need to conduct and which requires that technical knowledge. Now, she's right. She said certain members. And for those of you that didn't quite get what I'm getting at, here's what I mean.
Good evening. Lee Gill, Butterbrook Hill. I request, no, I implore Mayor Bass and all town council members to withhold the Facilities Utilization Committee reports to impartially reevaluate the candidates selected before going forward. Mr. Mayor, you campaigned on transparency and inclusion. Now is the time to prove it. There are definite conflicts of interest among the members of the Facilities Utilization Committee, to wit, Wendy Fallenbach, Board of Education member, which board refused to move to John Pettibone property. Paul Szymanski, Town Council member, not a professional structural engineer. As I say, a proctologist is not a colorectal surgeon. Tom Pilla, published newspaper articles against saving the Pettibone building in favor of tear down. Nick Pooter served for months on the new community center committee, and it's a conflict to serve on both committees and yet be chair of the Facilities Utilization Committee. Joe DiGregorio, again, a conflict to serve on both committees. He did serve on the community center up until the new baby came. Congratulations, Joe. In the fall of 2015, there were 25 members of the John Pettibone School Committee, one building being evaluated by 25. Yet, you only named 9 candidates to evaluate multiple facilities. This must be changed. The importance and qualifications of the Facilities Committee cannot be underestimated. You must publicly solicit the best qualified, non-biased, and apolitical members and remove those with existing conflicts and potential conflicts of interest. Hire economic development and structural engineering professionals to lead this facilities committee. We must know what we have and what to plan for. Very likely more classrooms in a few years. The obvious risk and potential liability for New Milford of an insufficient and self-serving study performed by an ethically challenged group, better described as nonpartisan, clique, lacking professional expertise, will be a major expense New Milford cannot afford. These decisions definitely affect our town long term. Costly, irresponsible, short-term actions will be your administration's legacy. And Mayor Bass, you deliberately did not refer to our new community center committee in your Spectrum interview for the facilities utilization report. We're not invisible. We've been working hard. It takes hours of work. We would like some recognition because we are working for the entire community. Yet, this facilities utilization committee included unsubstantiated financial data before the community center committee completed its mandated study. It's ongoing. We don't know what the results will be. How can you say costs are this or inflation is that when you don't know what we're working with yet? We're still in a survey portion. How do you create numbers before the needs are determined? The town hired a real estate brokerage firm to market town properties, including East Street. This was publicized. This is well known. If there are offers, why do we not know? There are rumors, substantial rumors, that there have been offers, good offers, sound offers that don't require givebacks from our town to develop East Street within the guidelines to keep it on the historical look and to serve the community. Why include East Street in the Facilities Utilization Committee study if this property is on the market? Thank you.
So I don't have time in this video to tear apart that clip because there's so much wrong with that clip. But if you'd like to see me shred that clip, let me know in the comments section, and maybe in another video I'll go ahead and shred that clip. Okay, so now it's time to get to my closing and parting thoughts. In the December 20th, 2018 Community Center Committee meeting, Jeff Winter basically opened the meeting by saying, and I quote, "I don't feel it's worth the time and effort necessary for us to move forward." What they decided was twofold. One, they weren't going to conduct the market research in-house, and two, they weren't going to request an extension in January. Now, these decisions were by no means unanimous, so don't get me wrong, there were certain members of the committee that wanted to conduct this research in-house and wanted to continue with this research moving forward. At this point, I cannot provide a rationale with continuing with the Community Center Committee as constituted, and furthermore, if one is going to be reconstituted, number one, their purpose needs to be extraordinarily specific, and number two, the people that are appointed to that committee must be extraordinarily technically proficient in the fields related to their charge. I don't think it's appropriate for the POCD to be conducting and handling the totality of this research. Now, the Library Modernization Committee wasn't composed of people who had technical proficiency, but that committee was basically nothing more than an advocacy group and fundraising resource. They left empirical research and technical work up to third parties who specialized in that sort of work and didn't have a stake in the matter. And most importantly, they did the fundraising for that research and technical preparation themselves. Now, I'll offer the caveat that if the Community Center Committee is reconstituted, and I can see a good rationale for reconstituting the Community Center Committee, then taking the approach of the Library Modernization Committee is an acceptable alternative. That said, it's obvious that this process is going to take years, as it did with the Library Modernization Committee, and as a member of the Facilities Utilization Committee, I can say with confidence that we can easily consolidate all of the services within that facility into other existing facilities. Are we really going to leave that building in limbo on a quarter occupancy with no income? Folks, this is the part of the video you've probably all been waiting for, but it's time to list Pettibone. You don't necessarily have to actually sell the building as you didn't do with East Street when Dakota presented their LOI, but it's time to put out a request for proposals. If nothing else, this will allow you to do an evaluation of what those two properties are actually worth in the open market. It'll also tell you exactly how much unbonded capital you'll have for future projects, including potentially a community center at another location. So that's pretty much all I have to say, but I'll leave you with this. All I'm asking for is a comparison of apples to apples. And for the record, I'm not the first one to say this on the record, and this is not new news. So in signing off, let me show you what was said at a Board of Education meeting by Angela Chastain, a board member, on October 18th, 2016.
We received an email from the mayor saying he was sending out an RFP for the East Street building. Do we know, is he sending out one for JPS as well? I mean, because I think
I only know what you know.
Okay, so obviously we need to get the other board members' opinions, but for me personally, I think to compare the two buildings, I think we need to compare apples to apples. And if we have a RFP for East Street, I think we need an RFP for JPS, because I think those people are going to come in and say, this is what's wrong, this is what we need to do, and to be able to accurately compare the two, I don't see how we can have an RFP for one building and not the other.